In terms of post-judicial review, the issue there has been delays. There are huge delays after someone, if they are refused by the federal court. The pre-removal risk analysis, the so-called PRA, has a 2 to 3% change of decision, and if the average time is 14 months to the PRA. The humanitarian compassion applications have about a 25% approval rate, but we don't know how many of those are refused refugee claimants as opposed to more normal applications. And then there's our issue of delays. So what we have here is, first of all, we've got approximately 2 months before, and that's a guesstimate, before the claim actually gets to the board. Right now, we've got 17 months for the board, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Then we've got 4 to 12 months for federal court, 4 months if it's refused at the lead stage, which most are, and then we have this black hole. You can see at the end the number 9, which is, right now, CIC says it takes 9 months to do the PRA. I'm doubtful of that. I think it's much longer. But what you've got in between is what I call a black hole, because those are claims are refused by the federal court, and nobody takes responsibility for them. And the PRA department officers only start counting once they send a notice that they're prepared to consider PRA. So what you've got is a very, very long process, and nobody knows how long it is. What's offensive is you will have the Minister of Immigration and others standing before Parliament telling them how wonderful, except for the RAD, how all of these wonderful things are going on in terms of it. It's a quite adequate review, and it's not. So, the backlog. Let's talk about the nasty, tough facts. And you notice we've got our storm warnings up there, so we're into the really black stuff here. So, the backlog right now is 58,000 claims at the board. It's rising daily. The IRB has the capacity to decide 25,000 per year. Our claim flow last year was over 36,000, and once again, there's no reason to think it's going to go down. The current delay in getting a decision is 18 months. I certainly expect it's going to go way past 2 years, and it may go as long as 3 years. We don't know how long the backlog is behind the federal court, because not only don't they have those numbers, CIC official told me that not that they just wouldn't disclose them, they don't have them. So the storm warnings, much longer delays in asylum claims, increasing claim flow pressures for reform to reduce the refugee claim flow, and I'll talk about what those mean in a minute. I'll talk about them now. And the one other aspect I didn't mention, we've also seen the politicization of the asylum process, comments made by the current minister, Jason Kenney, comments made by his deputy minister, Dick Fadden, and even some references by the Prime Minister, primarily around the claims from Mexico and Roma claims from the Republic of Czechoslovakia. Unfortunately, I must say this too, I don't know if there are IRB officials in the room. However, it must be said that the IRB issuing persuasive decisions in terms of Mexico has only gone in one direction. And in my view, they've gone off the straight and narrow in terms of non-bias that should be the position of any tribunal. So the concern is the minister has made quite clear statements about the kinds of reform they would like to see. And essentially, it's a form of slamming the door. He talks about a two-tier system like the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has changed the system 4 times in 7 years because they couldn't get it right. The reason they don't get it right is because they try and make a very quick, early decision by untrained decision makers without adequate interpretation, usually without counsel, without adequate reasoning, and without adequate country information. And the results are very bad decisions, but some people will turn away from the country very quickly. And the second aspect of it, when he talks about the two-tier system, well, the first tier is what he calls like democratic countries. It's fascinating. It says democratic countries. Even the federal court often they'll call them fledgling democracies because they don't really have a full range of state protections available. Well, countries such as Mexico and Czechoslovakia and many others, he wants to see on that list which will be some form of faster, more expedited, more draconian treatment of that category of refugee claimant. So in essence, it's slamming the door. What I'm not going to talk about in terms of Canada, but this will go on for endlessly, is first of all, the notion of migrant labor. That's a whole other issue and area, because we've seen a doubling of the number of authorized migrants coming to Canada for on-work authorizations. And of course, some of the problems in regard to that is there are significant abuses, both by recruiting companies and employers. There's lack of regulation by both the federal government and the provincial governments. The one bright shining exception is Manitoba, and all the provincial governments need to do is look at what Manitoba is doing and just do the same darn thing. And so they don't continually say it's too difficult. They haven't even tried. And secondly, I haven't spoken much about overseas sponsorship. That's where it's a resettlement program, because we have a significant flow of about 12,000 refugees a year coming in that way. The bad news isn't near so bad there. Again, it's the relative concept. Canada accepts at 12,000, is the second largest acceptor of overseas refugees after the United States and just before Australia. However, 12,000, the total for resettlement from all areas is about 100,000. And you'll see the kind of numbers I talk about for overseas refugees that are in need of protection. The one criticism is that the program has been plagued for years with slow processing, recalcitrant, unreasonable decisions by some visa officers. Okay, that's it for Canada. So we're out of the museum, we're out of Canada, and we're going to go to the world of international refugee protection. Very quickly, I'm going to give you some statistics. I've tried to keep the stats down, and let me be clear, particularly if I'm talking to a bunch of scholars, I play fast and loose when it comes to statistics. Most of these statistics are based on UNHCR, but sometimes it is the U.S. Refugee Committee, simply because UNHCR sometimes plays very cute with their statistics. For example, in terms of when they talk about refugees, they don't include any Palestinians because they're under UNRWA, a separate UN agency. So I follow the one that makes the most sense. I always give you 2008 numbers, except when they're not available. So here is the tough direct news. Refugees and asylum seekers in the world, right now about 14 million. It's been as high as about 17 or 18 during the turbulent mid-1990s, and it's gone down as low as 9. So as general in terms of the refugee flows, what we're seeing is things were better about 3 or 4 years ago, and now in many ways they're getting worse. Internally displaced people, 26 million. People barely talked about internally displaced 3 and 4 years ago, but there are huge numbers, and some are legitimate. They're not always displaced for refugee reasons, but we've also have internally displaced. The most graphic example is if we look at Darfur. We have people sitting in Chad who are here for their lives, and they are in camps being run by the United Nations, and they are refugees. We have people sitting within Sudan because they're no longer permitted to get out because Chad closed the border. They have the same fears for their life, sometimes from the same areas, and they are also in camps being managed by the United Nations. They are internally dispersed, although in terms of reality, there's very little difference between their situations. Lastly, the number of stateless people. Formerly, there's 3 million. The United Nations admits there's about 15 million. Some of them are more at risk than others. So the total of persons of concern, and I've actually left out a couple of small categories, is between 43 and 55 million people. That's a lot of need.